Salvete omnes. In this video, we will learn a new subordinate clause that takes a subjunctive verb, the indirect question. And just as indirect statements and indirect commands report back direct statements and direct commands after an introductory verb, the indirect question reports back a direct question after verbs of asking and other cognitive verbs. Before we look at indirect questions, let's review our direct questions in Latin. Direct questions in Latin are generally introduced by a number of interrogative or question words with a verb in the indicative mood. If you're asking an open-ended question in Latin, i.e. a question where you don't know whether the answer is yes or no, you use the enclitic ne. An enclitic is a word that attaches to the end of the word that in English it would typically introduce. The enclitic ne is used after the first word of the question, and for these questions, the verb is usually moved to the beginning of the sentence. So, if I were asking someone, do you study Latin? And I didn't know whether the answer is yes or no, in Latin I would say, studes ne linguae Latinae? It is also possible to not put the ne on the word introducing the question. And so you could also say linguae Latinae studes, and that would work. Just as in English, there are numerous question words that can introduce direct and indirect questions in Latin. You can pause the video at this point to make a note of the question words on the screen. And just a quick note, quis quid is the interrogative pronoun, meaning who or what. In the singular forms, the masculine and feminine are the same, but in the plural, the interrogative pronoun declines just like the relative pronoun. Qui quae quod here is the interrogative adjective, and qui quae quod declines exactly like the relative pronoun in both the singular and the plural. If you're asking a question where you expect either the answer yes or the answer no, there are two particles that are used in Latin. If you're asking a question where you expect the answer to be yes, you use the word nonne, meaning surely, at the start of the sentence. So if I were asking a question such as, surely you completed your homework, where I expected that of course you had done, I would say in Latin, nonne pensum domesticum perfecisti. If you're asking a question where you expect the answer no, you use the word num, meaning surely not, at the start of the sentence. So if I were asking, surely you didn't eat without me, in Latin I would say num sine me comedisti. If you're asking a double question in Latin, you would use the words utrum or ne for the first question and an before the second question. So if I were asking the question, are you coming with us or are you staying at home? I could say either utrum nobiscum venis an domi manes or venisne nobiscum an domi manes. If I were asking the question, are you coming with us or not? In direct questions, I would end the question with an non, meaning or not. As always with these pop-up grammar extras, this is not information that you need to know for class. This is just information if you're curious. Direct questions that use a subjunctive verb indicate that the subject of the question is deliberating about the action of the verb. These questions are often rhetorical in nature. If you are deliberating about present or future action, the present subjunctive is used. But if you're deliberating about past action, the imperfect subjunctive is used. And these subjunctives are known as deliberative subjunctives. So if you want to ask the question, what should I do? Or what am I to do? You would say, quid faciam. But if you were asking, what should I have done? Or what was I to do? You would say, quid facerem. Indirect questions are questions that follow an introductory verb of asking or any of the verbs that can introduce indirect statement. The main verbs of asking in Latin are rogo rogare, peto petere, and quaero quaerere. And the types of verbs that introduce indirect statement are verbs linked with mental activity or activity related to any of the five senses. So, for example, to think, to know, to understand, to see, to hear, etc. If you have a direct question introduced by one of the many question words in Latin, nothing changes about that direct question when it becomes an indirect question, except that the verb shifts into the subjunctive following the sequence of tenses rules. So, if your introductory verb is present, future, or future perfect, the verb in the indirect question will be either present or perfect subjunctive, where present shows action that's happening at the same time as the main verb, and the perfect subjunctive shows action that happened before the main verb. But if your main verb is imperfect, perfect, or pluperfect, the only types of subjunctives you can have in your indirect question are imperfect and pluperfect subjunctives, where imperfect subjunctive shows action happening at the same time as the main verb, and pluperfect subjunctive shows action that happened before the main verb. If you have any questions about the sequence of tenses rules, you can go back and watch the sequence of tenses video. So if you have a direct question that has a present tense verb, the only possible subjunctives you can have when that becomes an indirect question are the present or imperfect subjunctives, depending on sequence. So let's take an example. In the question, what are you eating? Quid comedis, we have a main verb that is the present tense. If we make that an indirect question after the introductory phrase scire wallo, I want to know, which introduces primary sequence, our full sentence in English would be, I want to know what you are eating, which in Latin would be scire wallo quid comedas, where comedas is the present subjunctive in an indirect question, showing simultaneous action in primary sequence. If we change our introductory phrase to scire volebam, I wanted to know, we now introduce secondary sequence. And so if we were reporting back quid comedis, this would become, I wanted to know what you were eating, which in Latin would be scire volebam quid comederes, where comederes is the imperfect subjunctive in an indirect question showing simultaneous action in secondary sequence. If you have a direct question that has a past tense verb as its main verb, then in an indirect question, that verb can only be the perfect or pluperfect subjunctives depending on sequence. So if we change our question to quid comedisti, what did you eat? Now, if we report that back after scire wallo, the full sentence in English would be, I want to know what you ate, which in Latin would be scire wallo quid comederis, where comederis is the perfect subjunctive in an indirect question showing past action in primary sequence. If our introductory phrase is scire volebam, introducing secondary sequence, the full sentence in English would be, I want to know what you had eaten, which in Latin would be scire volebam quid comedises, where comedises is the pluperfect subjunctive in an indirect question showing past action in secondary sequence. If you have an open-ended question that uses the enclitic ne as a direct question, in its indirect form, the ne disappears and it's introduced by the particles num or an. So in our previous example about studying Latin, as an indirect question, that would be rogant num linguae latinae studeas. They are asking whether you study the Latin language. If you have a double question in Latin, and it's an indirect question, then the first question is introduced by either utrum or ne, and the second question is still introduced by an. So again, to look back to our previous example, as an indirect question, if we wanted to say, I didn't know whether you were coming with us or staying at home, I would say, nesciebam utrum nobiscum venires, an domi maneres. And if you have the question, I didn't know if you were coming with us or not, whereas in a direct question, an non is used to indicate or not. In an indirect question, nekne is much more frequently used. You'll also notice that the subjunctives in indirect questions translate as if they are regular indicative verbs. So the present subjunctive is doing, the perfect subjunctive is did, the imperfect subjunctive is was doing, and the pluperfect subjunctive is had done. So, in this video, we reviewed direct questions in Latin, and we learned that indirect questions are formed using an introductory verb, a question word, and a verb in the subjunctive. We learned that the subjunctive verb in an indirect question follows the rules of sequence of tenses, and we also learned that subjunctives in indirect questions translate as if they were indicative verbs. You should now do the exercise entitled Indirect Questions, which can be found in our learning management system. As always, if you have any questions, either rewatch the video or reach out to me via email. Valete omnes.